The tax collector's boat had barely kissed the dock when Rogash Darkwolf walked out of the tree line with a war axe on her back and blood still drying on her knuckles. And every man on the Millhaven waterfront took one look at her and stepped aside so fast that half of them nearly fell into the lake. Every man except one. Jedediah Alden stood at the top of the mill road with a grain sack over one shoulder and flour dust in his dark hair, watching the crowd part like water around a stone, and he did not move. He did not run. He did not even shift his weight. He just looked at the orc woman walking up from the lakeshore and thought, with the particular, bone-deep calm of a man who has already lost almost everything, and therefore has very little left to fear, that she was without question the most striking person he had ever seen in his life. She was tall, nearly a head taller than him, with broad, squared shoulders, and the kind of build that made the fitted leather warrior's vest she wore look like it had been made specifically to contain something dangerous. The vest was deep charcoal gray with copper rivets running up the sides, laced tight at the front over a dark linen undershirt, paired with close-fitting dark riding leathers tucked into worn black boots that came to her knee. A short travel cloak was pinned at one shoulder, deep forest green, flapping in the lake wind. Her skin was the color of weathered oak, a deep and warm gray-green, and she wore it like armor itself. Her tusks curved up from the corners of a strong jaw, not the hulking, brutish tusks of the old war stories, but clean and pale like ivory inlaid in a beautiful piece of woodwork. Her eyes were amber, not brown that someone might generously call amber. Actually amber, catching the flat gray autumn light off Millhaven Lake and holding it. And she had a bruise forming over her left cheekbone, a split in her lower lip, and the kind of expression that said she had not merely survived whatever had happened to her recently, but had settled the matter permanently. The tax collector, a red-faced, pudgy man named Harwell Pott who wore the Duke of Calrath's copper badge on his coat and used it like a weapon, was standing on the dock with 4 armsmen behind him, and he had frozen the same as everyone else. He found his voice first, which was his habit and his worst quality. "Orc," he called out, loud enough that his voice carried across the whole quiet waterfront. "This is a toll road duchy under the protection of the Duke of Calrath. You have no business on a human settlement dock." Rogash Darkwolf stopped walking. She turned her amber eyes on him slowly, the way a hawk turns to look at something that has made a very small and unwise noise. "I have business," she said. Her voice was low and carrying, accented with the rolling vowels of the Eastern Orc clans, and she did not raise it. "I have business with your miller, unless that is also something you have taxed." That was when Jedediah Alden put down his grain sack, dusted his hands on his trousers, and walked down the mill road toward the dock. He was not a large man. Medium height, lean-built from years of work, with the kind of forearms a miller develops and the kind of weathered face a man develops when he spends his days between open water and grinding stone. 28 years old, dark-eyed, unremarkable in every way that the world generally uses to measure men. He had a mill that had once belonged to his father, and was now technically in arrears to Harwell Pott and the Duke of Calrath for 3 seasons of taxes, and he had about 40 villagers who depended on that mill to grind their grain, and he had gotten up that morning expecting nothing more extraordinary than another miserable conversation with Pott about payment schedules. He walked past the frozen onlookers and past Pott's armsmen and stopped about 3 feet from Rogash Darkwolf. "I am the miller," he said. "Jedediah Alden. Are you the one who sent the letter about the grain barge contract?" She looked at him. Her amber eyes moved over him once, quick and thorough, the assessment of a warrior checking for weapons first, then reading the man. Whatever she found, it made something in her expression shift just slightly, the way a bolt slides back. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Come up to the mill. I have tea on." He picked up his grain sack, turned, and walked back up the mill road. After exactly 2 seconds of silence, she followed him. Behind them, Harwell Pott made a noise that was somewhere between outrage and bafflement, and one of his armsmen said quietly, "Should we?" and Pott said, "Don't." Rogash Darkwolf had not expected tea. She had expected, at best, a door opened a crack and a suspicious eye and someone muttering about coming back when the sun was higher, which was what she had gotten at the last 4 villages she had tried before arriving at Millhaven. At worst, she had expected the kind of welcome she had gotten at Thornbury, which had involved people throwing things, and which was why her knuckles were still sore. The miller's house was attached to the mill itself, a solid, well-built structure of pale lake stone and dark timber that sat on a rocky spit of land where the mill stream met the lake. The wheel was turning, which surprised her. Mills in dying villages usually went quiet first, because silence was cheaper than work. This wheel was turning and the stones inside were grinding something, and the smell of warm grain dust was in the air, and there were actual boats tied up at the small dock below the mill house, small lake fishing boats, nothing grand, but present and solid and real. He held the door and she had to duck slightly to pass through, which she did without comment, because she had been ducking through human doors since she was 17, and she had long since stopped finding it remarkable. The mill house interior was modest. A stone hearth, a heavy work table covered in ledger papers, a shelf of tools, a smaller table near the hearth with 2 chairs, and a tin kettle that was, in fact, already on the fire and already making noise. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the ledger papers. He set the grain sack down, washed his hands at a basin, and began making tea with the economical movements of a man who does not waste effort on performance. "You want to sit," he said, without looking at her. "I will stand," she said. "All right." He set 2 cups on the small table anyway. "The letter said you had a proposition about the summer grain routes from the Eastern Pass." "The letter said I was looking for a miller who was not under Pot's complete control," she said. "I used more diplomatic wording, but that is what it said." He looked up at her then, direct, calm, dark eyes that did not flinch. "Who are you?" he said. The letter was signed with a clan mark but not a name. "Rogash Darkwolf," she said, "former war leader of the Darkwolf clan of the Greywash Mountains." "Former," he said. "Former," she confirmed. He poured the tea and set 1 cup on her side of the table and sat down in his chair, wrapping both hands around his own cup. "What happened?" It was such a plain, direct question that she found herself answering it, which was not something she had planned. "My second-in-command wanted my position," she said. "He built enough support among the eastern subclans to force a challenge. The challenge was formally valid under clan law, so there was nothing to dispute. I lost. Not the fight I won. But when a challenge is won by the challenger's coalition rather than by arms, the result still stands. I was exiled by majority clan vote 3 months ago." He was quiet for a moment. "So you won the fight but lost the vote?" "Yes." "And you have been traveling since?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if this answered a question he had been turning over. "Thornbury gave you that," he said, nodding at her cheek. She touched the bruise without thinking. "Thornbury had 6 men with clubs," she said. "They were under the impression that an exiled orc war leader traveling alone was easy prey. They were corrected." "I imagine they were," he said, and there was no mockery in it and no performance of shock. There was something almost like the quiet satisfaction of a man who is pleased that the world occasionally makes sense. "The contract in the letter," he said. "The Eastern Pass routes. What is the actual proposal?" She wrapped her hands around the teacup. Her hands were large and capable, the knuckles scarred, and the cup looked ridiculous in them, but she held it with a certain careful precision, as if the smallness of the object was not something she was going to let inconvenience her. "I know the passes," she said. "Every route from the Greywash Highlands to the Lake Country, every clan territory boundary, every safe waypoint. I spent 12 years leading patrols through that range. The grain that gets grown in the Highland settlements cannot get to market without going through Darkwolf territory. But my former clan has been charging a passage tithe that makes the route unprofitable. If someone with established trade contacts on the lake could cut a direct agreement with the Highland farmers, bypassing the clan tithe, They could move grain through the pass I know, the pass that the Darkwolf clan does not officially acknowledge, because it runs through a stretch of territory that was mine by personal right and not clan grant. It was always mine to negotiate with. Jedediah set down his cup. His expression was thoughtful, focused, and she noticed for the first time that there was nothing in his face that said he was humoring her. He was actually listening. That pass still belongs to you, even after exile. Personal holdings are not revoked by exile unless they were granted by the clan council. Mine was not. It was inherited from my grandmother, who held it before the Darkwolf clan even formally existed. It is, technically and legally under Orc clan law, still mine. He picked up his cup again. How many loads a season could you move through that pass? And that was when Rogash Darkwolf understood that she had, against all odds and all reasonable expectation, found the right man. They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, they had the bones of an agreement not finished, not signed, but real and specific and built on logic. The Highland farmers needed a market route. He needed grain supply that did not depend on Pot's mercy. She needed an income and a base of operations, and though she did not say this part aloud, she needed somewhere to be that was not the road. When she stood to leave, he said, "There is a room above the mill. It was my father's workshop. It is empty. You can use it while we work out the details if you do not have somewhere else." She looked at him. "I am not offering charity," he said quickly, reading something in her expression correctly. "You will be useful. I have 3 Highland contacts I have been trying to reach for 2 seasons, and I cannot do it alone and manage the mill at the same time. If you are going to be moving between here and the pass anyway, you can carry messages." "Messages," she said flatly. "And you can help me move the autumn stockpile down from the upper dock," he added. "Those sacks are heavier than I like." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, a tension at the corner of her mouth, a brief warmth in the amber of her eyes, but it was real. "I will look at the room," she said. The room was small, with a low ceiling that made her stand carefully in the center, and a window that looked directly out over the lake, and a decent rope bed and a washstand. She stood at the window for a long moment and looked at the gray water and the far shore with its dark tree line, and she thought about the last 3 months, and about the road from the Greywash passes to the lowlands, and about the way that Miller had looked at her, not through her, not past her, not around her with the careful, deliberate inattention that most humans used when they encountered her, but directly at her, with the same attention a competent craftsman gives to a material he wants to understand. She was not accustomed to it. After a lifetime of being the one who commanded, who was deferred to, who was either feared or obeyed, being simply looked at was strange. She was not, if she was honest with herself, entirely without feelings about it. She stayed. The first 2 weeks were practical and busy in a way she found genuinely welcome, because practical and busy left little room for the particular misery that had been her constant companion since the exile vote. She moved grain sacks. She carried letters to the Highland track that ran above the lake's north shore. She stood in doorways and watched him work the mill and asked questions and got plain, detailed answers, and she began to understand the machinery of the place. The wheel, the stones, the chutes, the storage, the complicated arithmetic of a village's survival all flowing through this one building. He was good at what he did. That mattered to her in a way she had not anticipated. She had expected a struggling man in a failing mill making desperate compromises, and instead she had found someone who was genuinely skilled, who knew his stones and his wheel and the weight of water and the quality of grain the way she knew terrain and weather and the weight of a blade. The mill was not failing because of any failure in him. It was failing because Harwell Pot was bleeding it dry with quarterly tax assessments that had increased 3 times in 2 years, and because the Duke of Calrath had decided that the Millhaven region was a convenient revenue pool rather than a community worth maintaining, and because Jedediah Alden, being one man alone with a wheel and a grinding stone, had no political recourse and no leverage. She was, as she had been through most of her adult life, furious about the powerful taking from the powerless. She was also, as she had been through most of her adult life, building a plan to do something about it. He noticed. He noticed because he noticed most things in the quiet way of people who have learned to pay close attention to what is actually in the room with them rather than what they expected to find. On the third week he looked up from his ledgers one evening and said, "You are counting something." She was sitting by the hearth with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of board, doing exactly that. She looked up. "Pot's schedule," she said. "He makes his collection rounds in a pattern. I have been watching the pattern. He comes to Millhaven every 42 days. He has an assessment meeting in Dunmore, that is the regional seat. 2 days ride north every 28 days. There is a gap of 14 days between his last Millhaven collection and his next Dunmore meeting where he has no official obligations recorded in the Duke's public courier schedule." He was very still. "How do you know the Duke's public courier schedule?" "I have been corresponding with someone in Dunmore," she said. "A factor I worked with briefly on the eastern grain routes before." She meant before the exile. She did not say it. "He is not fond of pot." "Who is?" "No one with sense." She set down the charcoal. "That 14-day window is when Pot does his unofficial business. The collections he does not report to the Duke. The payments that go to Pot's own accounts rather than to Calreth's treasury. Your mill is not the only one. There are 6 grinding operations in this Lake District, and 5 of them are carrying assessments that no legitimate Duke's tax schedule should produce. The actual tax is perhaps half of what you are paying, possibly less." The silence in the room was long. The fire crackled. Outside, the lake wind was picking up, making the window creak. "If I could prove that," he said quietly. "If someone could show that Pot is keeping the difference." "The Duke of Calreth is not a good man," she said, "but he is a man who despises being stolen from. His factor in Dunmore has already been quietly collecting documentation for 2 years. He needs one more piece. A miller who can provide a season-by-season account of assessments charged versus the official rate schedule, with signature and seal." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have been working on this since you got here." "I had the bones of it before I got here," she said. "I needed someone with clean records. Your ledgers are meticulous, Alden." "I looked." "You looked through my ledgers." "You left them on the table. They were face down. They were face down in stacks that told me everything I needed to know about the organization system before I even turned them over." She watched his face. "You are not angry." "I am a little angry," he said, and then after a pause, "but mostly I am." He stopped. "Relieved," she offered. "That," he said. "Yes, that." The look between them lasted a beat longer than it needed to. She broke it first, returning to her charcoal and her board, and he returned to his ledgers. But the room felt different after that, warmer somehow, charged with the particular tension of 2 people who have recognized something in each other that neither of them has quite named yet. She began to understand that she was in a specific kind of trouble. She had known attractive men. She had known men of quality and men of courage and men who were good at their work. She had, in the time before the exile, had the kind of brief, mutually satisfying arrangements that a woman of her rank and independence could afford to have without complication. She was not inexperienced. She was not naive. She understood desire as a practical matter. What she was not accustomed to was the slow, compounding accumulation of small things. The way he made sure there was always hot water at the washstand when she came back from the Highland track, without ever mentioning it. The way he explained the mill machinery to her without condescension, treating her intelligence as a given. The way he laughed, which was quiet and sudden and real, when she said something dry. The way he did not look away when she looked at him, did not break eye contact first, did not perform the reflexive human discomfort around her tusks or her size that she had learned to expect. She thought about it more than she intended to. She thought about it while moving grain sacks, which required no mental involvement, and while watching the lake in the evenings, and occasionally while lying in the rope bed above the mill with the sound of water below and the distant creak of the wheel. which had become, in a few weeks, the sound of somewhere she might actually be willing to call a home. This was, she told herself, impractical. She was exiled. She was in the middle of a complicated plan that required clear thinking. She was a guest in his house under a business arrangement. She had spent 12 years as a clan war leader, which meant 12 years of subordinating personal feeling to the requirements of command, and she was not about to stop doing that now simply because a human miller had kind eyes and steady hands. She told herself these things while watching him work the millstone one afternoon in the low October light, flour dust drifting in the air around him, his arms working the adjustment lever, his face intent and careful, and she thought with involuntary honesty that he was actually quite beautiful in the particular way of people who do not know they are beautiful, which was the most dangerous kind. She went back to the Highland track the next morning before he was awake and walked fast for 3 hours before the honest ache in her chest started to fade. It was on that trip that she encountered the problem she had been expecting and dreading. The pass that ran through her personal territory was not unguarded. She had known, when she planned this, that her former second-in-command, a heavy, cold-eyed orc named Gruth who had spent 5 years watching her with the careful patience of a man who intends to have what another person has, would not simply leave her personal pass alone. She had hoped he would be occupied with the problems of actually running the Darkwolf clan, which were considerable and which he had not done well enough in training to handle smoothly. She had been, perhaps, optimistic. There were 3 Darkwolf scouts on the upper track, sitting by a fire as though they owned it, which in the purely practical sense they currently did, since Gruth had taken the clan leadership, and the clan had territory rights over the surrounding range. Her personal pass was the exception, but the approach track was not hers to command. She stopped on the track above them and made enough noise that they heard her before she reached them, because surprising Darkwolf scouts was a poor way to begin a conversation. They looked up, 2 of them she knew. The third was young, barely past 20, with the look of someone who had been told what to think about the exile and had thought it obediently. Rogash, said the older of the 2 she knew, a grizzled woman named Hadra. Her tone was neutral in the way that neutral tones contain volumes. Gruth said you might come back this way. Gruth says many things, Rogash said. How are his ears, the left one specifically? Hadra's mouth twitched. He wears his hair differently now. I imagine he does. She stopped at the edge of their fire's light. I am not here to challenge the clan's hold on the upper range. I am here for my pass. The Darkwolf clan has no authority over it. Gruth knows this. Gruth knows it, Hadra agreed. He also sent word that you were to be turned back from the approach track, which is clan territory. The approach track runs through clan territory for 2 miles, Rogash said. I have the right of personal passage on any path that leads to personal holdings. Clan Law Article 12, the right of approach. The young scout started to say something. Hadra put a hand on his arm. There was a long pause. The fire popped. We were not told to hurt you, Hadra said finally. We were told to turn you back. There is a difference. There is a difference, Rogash agreed, but I am not going to be turned back. So we are at an impasse, and I would like to resolve it without anyone getting hurt, because I know both of you and I have no quarrel with you personally. Hadra looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at the young scout, and then at the other scout, and something moved between them that Rogash recognized the old loyalty, the one that ran deeper than politics, the one that Gruth had counted on smothering with his coalition, but which was not in practice so easy to smother. We went asleep early tonight, Hadra said finally, and stood and turned away from the fire and went to her bedroll. The other old scout followed. The young one hesitated, looked at Rogash, looked at Hadra's back, and went to his own bedroll. Rogash walked through their camp and up the track to her pass. She was back at the mill by morning with the route confirmed, 3 verbal commitments from Highland farmers, and a bone-deep clarity about what she was going to do about Gruth, which was going to require both a little more time and considerably more leverage than she currently had. Jedediah was grinding when she came through the door, and he looked up with the kind of look that she chose, in the interest of her own sanity, to interpret as simply professional concern about the business partnership. "Any trouble?" he said. "Managed," she said. "I have 3 committed routes. I need you to write back to your Highland contacts today. We need to move the first shipment before the first snowfall." "That gives us about a month," he said. "Then we should not waste it." They did not waste it. The month before first snowfall was the busiest period of Rogash Darkwolf's recent memory, and she had led war-band campaigns through mountain winters, so that was not a small statement. There were letters to write and routes to confirm, and a particular 3-day journey over the pass with the first actual grain shipment. 4 mules and a cart and herself walking ahead with a blade at her hip. That required negotiating both the clan territory approach track and the weather, which had opinions. She came back from that first run cold to her bones and exhausted and deeply satisfied, and she came into the mill house and found Jedediah at the hearth with a pot of something hot on the fire, and a look on his face that was doing things to her careful composure that she did not entirely appreciate. "Successful," he said. "The grain is in the storage barn at Reeves Crossing. It will move by lake boat to the Dunmore market in 3 days." She dropped her pack and sat down at the table heavily. "The pass held. We can run 4 loads before the mountain snows close it and then resume in early spring. 4 loads in one season is enough to change the accounts," he said. "The Dunmore market price will cover your shortfall to pot and leave enough over to rebuild your reserve," she confirmed. "I calculated it on the way down." He ladled something into a bowl and set it in front of her. A thick grain and root soup, hot enough to steam. She looked at it and then up at him, and he was standing very close because the table was small and the room was quiet. "Thank you," she said, which came out rougher than she intended, because she was tired and because his being kind to her when she was tired was a specific kind of difficulty. "Thank you," he said back, with a simplicity that was more unsettling than anything complicated would have been. "I mean that. I was going to lose this mill, Rogash, by spring. There was nowhere else to go." She held his gaze. The amber of her eyes in the firelight was warm and open in a way she rarely let them be. "You were not going to lose it," she said. "You were never the problem, pot was the problem. Either way," he said, "you found the solution." "We found it," she said. Something shifted in the small distance between them. He didn't move. She didn't move. The fire crackled and the lake wind pressed at the window and the wheel kept turning outside in the dark water. "Eat," he said finally, and went back to his own side of the table, and she ate, and they talked about the next shipment route, and neither of them mentioned what had been in the room for a few seconds, but it stayed there, settled between them like something warm. Harwell Pot arrived on his next collection round on a cold, bright morning in late October with his 4 armsmen and his copper badge, and the particular air of a man who has heard rumors and has come to deal with them. The rumors were not entirely false. Pot had people. He had always had people, watchers and talkers in every lake village on his route, and they had told him that the Millhaven miller had taken on a partner, an orc, an exiled clan leader, and that trade was moving through a pass that was not on any official route, and therefore not generating the assessments that Pot required for his personal accounting. He came to the mill dock with raised voice already prepared. Rogash was on the dock when his boat came in. She had not planned it that way. She had been moving a load of empty sacks from the storage shelf to the dock for the next run, but she stood there with a stack of sacks over one shoulder and watched his boat approach and felt the old war leader calm settle over her like a second skin, that particular stillness that comes before a significant engagement. The people who had been going about their business on the Millhaven waterfront did what people on the Millhaven waterfront had done the first morning. They moved aside, fisher wives with their baskets, a boy leading a goat, old Marrett from the Netrapair shed. They all drifted back from the dock, creating a clear space, the way crowds always create space around things they sense are going to become interesting. Pot came off the boat with his badge gleaming and his armsman behind him and stopped when he saw her. She could see the calculation in his face, the size of her, the axe on her back, the question of whether she was a problem that required his armsman or merely a problem that required his voice. He chose his voice. He usually did until he ran out of it. "You," he said. "Orc, what are you doing at this mill?" "Moving sacks," she said pleasantly. "I have been informed that trade is moving through this district on unregistered routes and that you are involved." "I move grain through a pass I own," she said. "My personal property. It has never required registration with anyone. All trade in the Calreth Duchy. The pass is outside the duchy boundary," she said, "by half a mile. I had it surveyed when the original charter was drawn. The pass is in the Free Highland Range. It generates no duchy toll and requires no duchy registration. This is on record in the Dunmore Land Office." Pot's face had gone a particular color. "The miller's arrangement with you is a private business contract between two parties for the transport of goods through a route not subject to duchy toll," she said. "You are welcome to contest it in the Dunmore Assizes." He stared at her. His armsmen were very still behind him. The crowd on the waterfront was very still in a different way, the stillness of people who are watching something that is not going the way they expected. Then Pot looked past her at Jedediah, who had come out of the mill house and was standing on the dock behind Rogash with his arms folded, watching with calm, dark eyes. "Alden," Pot said, "you are still behind on your quarterly assessment." "I have the payment inside," Jedediah said. "All 3 outstanding quarters, in full. Would you like to come in and sign the receipt?" Pot's mouth opened and then closed. 3 quarters in full was not what he had expected. 3 quarters in full, paid all at once, by a mill he had been watching struggle for 2 years, meant something had changed, and he could see it in the slight satisfaction on the miller's face, and he did not like what it implied for his ongoing strategy. He went into the mill house and signed the receipt and came out again and got back on his boat with his armsmen. And as he went, his eyes cut back to Rogash one more time with the look of a man who is postponing something rather than abandoning it. She watched his boat move away from the dock and felt the cold lake wind on her face and thought about that look. "He is going to come back with something more serious," she said, when Jedediah came to stand beside her on the dock. "I know," he said. "He does not like losing control of a revenue source, and he will eventually figure out that I am building the documentation case for his misconduct alongside the grain trade. Can he do something about you legally?" She turned that over. "He can try to file a claim that my pass is within the duchy boundary. If he moves fast enough and bribes the right surveyor, he might get a counter-survey done. It would not stand up at trial, but it might buy him an injunction that delays the trade route long enough to break the Highland contracts. How much time do we have before he can do that?" "Winter," she said. "The passes will be closed in 3 or 4 weeks. Once the snows come, there is nothing to injunct. He would have to wait until spring to move legally. By spring, the documentation case will be ready," he said. "My contact in Dunmore said 6 weeks. Then we race the weather," she said. 3 more loads, 3 more," he nodded. And then, in the particular, careful way he had when he was going to say something he had been considering for a while, he said, "I want you to know that I would not have gotten to this point without you. And I am," he paused, "I am grateful for more than the business." She looked at him. The wind was cold and the dock boards were damp and the lake spread gray and wide behind him, and he was watching her with the same direct, uncomplicated attention he had given her from the first morning, and it was still the most disarming thing about him. "You are grateful for what, then?" she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. "Company," he said simply. "The mill gets quiet." She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "it does." They stood on the dock together in the cold wind, not touching, watching the lake, and that was the truest conversation either of them had had in a very long time. The second load went smoothly. The third had weather trouble, a storm off the lake that hit the lower approach track and turned the path to mud, and Rogash arrived back at the mill 2 days late. soaked through and carrying a twisted ankle from a slope that had given way. And she came in through the mill house door and found him awake, at the work table with a lantern, because it was past midnight and she was 2 days late. He stood up when she came in. She was wet and muddy and her ankle was throbbing and she was holding herself carefully, the way she did when something hurt and she was trying not to advertise it, and he crossed the room to her in 3 steps and said, "You are hurt." "My ankle, it is not broken. Sit down." "I do not sit down, Rogash." She sat down because the ankle did genuinely hurt and because she was tired, and he knelt and looked at the ankle with careful hands. Not a healer's hands, but a practical man's hands, the kind that are accustomed to dealing with what the world presents, and he said, "Sprained. Bad. You walked on this for 2 days." "The load needed to be secured," she said. He looked up at her from where he was kneeling, and the angle of it put his face upturned and close, and the lantern light was between them, and his expression was not performing either admiration or concern, but simply feeling both of them at once openly, in the guileless way that was entirely peculiar to him. "You are impossible," he said. "You knew that," she said. "I did," he said, and something in his voice was warm and rough, and she felt it in her chest, which was not, she had to admit at this point, something she could continue pretending was merely the general effect of physical proximity. He bound her ankle with strips of linen from the shelf and made her drink 2 cups of hot water with dried root bark in it for the swelling. And by the time the fire had burned down to coals, they were both sitting on the hearthrug with their backs against the stone and their shoulders close but not touching. And the mill wheel was turning in the dark water outside, and the wind had settled, and she thought, quite clearly, and without the ability to convince herself otherwise, that she wanted to stay here. Not the room above the mill. Here, this life, this specific life in this specific place with this specific man. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "Jedediah," she said. He turned. And the thing that had been building between them for weeks was in the room so completely that it was like a change in pressure, and she watched him feel it at the same moment she did, watched it move across his face with the transparency of someone who is not accustomed to concealing things. "Yes," he said. "I am not good at this," she said. "I am telling you that first so it is understood." "Neither am I," he said. "You are better than you think," she said, and leaned across the small space between them and kissed him. It was not a small kiss. It was the kind that happens when 2 people have been withholding something considerable for some time, the kind with heat and honesty, and the particular urgency of people who are both aware they almost let this go past without acting on it. His hand came up to her jaw, large to him, fitting to her, and she felt his thumb trace carefully past her tusk, not around it, not avoiding it, simply touching her face as her face was, and that small specific thing moved through her like something unlocking. When she pulled back, they were both breathing differently. "All right," he said. His voice had gone rough. "All right. I was not going to wait any longer," she said. "I have been trying to figure out how to," he stopped. "I did not know if you, Jedediah," she said. "I watched you from across the waterfront that first morning and I thought you were remarkable. I have been fighting it for 6 weeks because we had a business arrangement and I did not want to complicate it." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "What changed?" he said. "You were awake at midnight because I was 2 days late," she said. "With a lantern." He opened his mouth and closed it. "That is what changed," she said. He took her hand, both of his closing around it, and held it with a steadiness that said everything the words had not gotten to yet. "I have been alone here for 3 years," he said. "Since my father died and I took the mill on, I did not," he looked down at their joined hands. "I had stopped thinking in terms of there being someone here with me." "You were always going to have someone here," she said. "You just had to wait for the right one to walk up the dock." He laughed at that, the sudden, quiet, real laugh that she had catalogued early as one of her favorite things about him, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through her. They moved from the hearthrug to somewhere more comfortable eventually, and it was warm and unhurried and deeply, achingly felt, the kind of intimacy that has nothing to prove, That is simply two people choosing to be completely present with each other. And she fell asleep with the mill wheel turning below and his arms solid and warm around her, and thought that she had not slept this well in approximately 3 months, which was, perhaps, the most honest measure of how much the exile had cost her. The fourth and final load before snowfall made it through the pass on a knife edge of timing. She could see the weather coming from the northeast as she was bringing the mules down the lower slope, a gray wall of cloud eating the peaks behind her. And she pushed the pace hard enough that she was running by the last mile, and the snow started falling when she was still a quarter mile from the tree line, but the load was ahead of her and safe, and she came into the valley at the foot of the pass in 6 inches of new snow laughing at the sky. She was still laughing when she got back to the mill that night. He opened the door before she knocked and looked at her snow-covered and red-cheeked and laughing, and the look on his face was so transparently delighted that she had to stop laughing to look at it properly. "The load is safe," she said. "I see that," he said. "The pass is closed now. 4 loads, Jedediah. That is everything we needed," he said. "Come inside." She came inside. They spent the first week of winter finishing the documentation package for the Dunmore factor. It was meticulous work, built from Jedediah's ledgers, Rogash's survey records for the pass, and the information from the Dunmore contact, a careful, precise accounting of the gap between the official Calrath tax schedule and the actual assessments Pot had been collecting, spread across 6 mills in the Lake District over 4 years. The numbers were damning with the cold certainty of arithmetic. Pot had been taking, by their reckoning, nearly 40% of every collection round for his own use, amounting to a sum that would have built a new city gate. The package went out by courier to Dunmore in the 2nd week of December. And then, because Harwell Pot had people in every village, and because his people were watching the courier traffic the same way everyone with something to hide watches the mail, Pot found out about it by the 3rd week of December. He did not come alone this time. He came with 6 armsmen and a duchy warrant, and he came by land on horseback rather than by boat, arriving in Millhaven before dawn on a morning when the snow was thick on the ground, and the lake was beginning to ice at the edges, and he went to the mill house and pounded on the door with the authority of a man who expects doors to open for him. Jedediah opened it. Pot, in his winter coat and with his breath steaming in the cold air, looked past him at the room beyond, where Rogash was rising from the chair by the fire with the particular unhurried gravity of someone who has been awake and waiting. Pot's face changed when he saw her there in the miller's house, at the miller's fire at this hour of the morning in a way that could only mean what it clearly meant, and the change was a complex mix of information he had not expected and calculation he was rapidly running on what to do with it. His eyes went from her to Jedediah and back, and something mean and sharp entered his expression. "Alden," he said, "I have a duchy warrant for the seizure of records relating to unlawful trade activity." "The trade activity is lawful," Jedediah said, with the levelness of a man who has thought this conversation through. "The records will demonstrate that. I also have a warrant for the detainment of a non-citizen orc operating within duchy boundaries without a registered trade permit." Pot looked at Rogash directly. You are outside your permitted territory. Exiled clan members have no right of residence in human duchy settlements without a residential permit, which you do not have." Rogash said nothing. Her amber eyes were measuring. "The residential permit requirement," Jedediah said, "applies to non-citizen residents. A spouse of a duchy citizen is exempt under the Calrath Regional Compact, Article 7. Pot blinked. "You are not married to this, not yet," Jedediah said. "But I am requesting to be, today, under the Compact's intention to marry provision which grants a 30-day protection of residency status while the bond is formalized. Article 7, Paragraph 4. There was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. Rogash's eyes moved to him. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Pot, but the back of his neck had gone red in a way that told her everything about how carefully considered and how genuinely terrifying that statement had been for him to make. You can't. Pot started. I can verify the relevant compact article if you would like, Jedediah said. I have the Calreth Regional Compact in the Millhouse archive. My father kept a copy. It is annotated. He paused. My father was thorough about legal documentation. I inherited that. Pot looked at him. Then he looked at Rogash. Then he looked back at Jedediah, and the calculation was visible in his face, the gears of a man trying to find the angle that works. This is a delay tactic, he said. It is a legal right, Jedediah said. Contested detainments under intent to marry protection go to the Dunmore Assizes for review, which will, as it happens, also be reviewing the documentation package we sent last week. I imagine all of it coming before the same magistrate at the same time would be very efficient. The 6 armsmen stood behind Pot in the cold morning air and said nothing. They were hired men, not devoted ones, and devoted men would have been required for what Pot was considering, which was illegal enough that even Pot could not say it out loud. He left. The door closed. The fire crackled. The silence in the mill house was complete and specific. Rogash turned to look at Jedediah. He turned to look at her. I should have asked you first, he said immediately. I am aware that I should have, Jedediah, she said. It is a legal mechanism. It does not have to, Jedediah. He stopped. Was it only a legal mechanism, she said. The back of his neck was still red. His hands were at his sides still, and he was looking at her with that direct, unguarded honesty that had been his most dangerous quality from the first morning. No, he said. It was not. She covered the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed him with a conviction that she hoped communicated everything she had not yet managed to say neatly and in words, which was that she had been an exile for 3 months before she arrived here, and she had walked through a dozen human villages and been driven out of most of them. And she had built this plan and carried it carefully because she was good at surviving and making things work. But she had not, in all those months, expected to find something like this, someone like this. And she was not a woman who made small decisions, and she was not going to treat this as a small one. When she pulled back, he was holding her face in both hands and looking at her with an expression that was almost wonder. All right, he said, for the second time in the rough-voiced way he had the first time that she was beginning to think of as specifically his. All right, she agreed. So we are, she confirmed. The legal part, he said. I want to do the legal part also. He stopped and seemed to be choosing his words with real care. I want it to be real, not just the mechanism. I want you here with me for longer than 30 days. She looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, the ice-edged lake gleamed in the early winter light, and the snow lay quiet on the dock boards, and the wheel was turning in the cold water below, and she thought of the room above the mill that had started to feel like somewhere she lived rather than somewhere she stayed, and the harbor water and the grain smell and the feel of his kitchen fire in the evenings, and she said, yes. The word cost her nothing. It came out as easily and naturally as breathing, and that ease was, she thought, the most reliable evidence that it was the right answer. Now there was still Pot. The 30 days moved fast, full of the particular anxiety of people waiting to see which way something is going to fall. The mill was quiet in the winter the way mills in lake villages are quiet, less work, but more maintenance, the wheel going at reduced speed, the path to the dock icy and careful. They lived in it together in the companionable way of 2 people who have decided without much further discussion that this is what they are doing, that this is the shape of things. He taught her more of the mill, the mechanics of the stone dressing, the way the hopper needed tending in cold weather, the particular groan of the wheel shaft that meant ice was building on the north face. She taught him the past geography in full detail, the route maps she kept in her head that she had never had reason to put on paper before, drawing them by firelight on the large flat boards she found in the workshop above, and he studied them with the same attentive seriousness he brought to everything. They argued about the route logistics twice, both times loudly enough that Merritt from the net repair shed later told several other people that the miller and his orc had a good set of lungs between them. Both arguments were resolved within an hour by one of them being right in a way the other could not rebut, and they did not go to bed angry either time, which she thought was possibly its own kind of good sign. He was patient with her silences, which were frequent and could run long, and she learned that his tendency to fidget with things, always something in his hands, a gear, a tool, a pencil, was his version of the same thing, and not restlessness but thought, and she stopped reading it as distraction. She learned that he woke before her, and she learned the sound of the particular creak the mill house door made when he went out to check the wheel in the early morning, and she learned, without deciding to, that she listened for the sound of it from bed, and that she did not go fully back to sleep until she heard him come back in. He learned, she suspected, that she always positioned herself toward the door, always sat with her back to a wall when she could, always listened for what was outside the room they were in, and he adjusted the furniture in the mill house main room without comment, so that her preferred chair was in the corner with a wall behind it, and she noticed and felt something wordless and warm about it. On the 19th day of the 30, the letter arrived from Dunmore. It was official correspondence, on Duke's stationery, sealed with the Calrath signet. It was addressed to Harwell Pott, care of his last known official address in Millhaven, and a copy was addressed to each of the 6 mills in the Lake District. The factor had moved fast once the documentation package landed, faster than she had hoped, which meant the irregularities had been even more flagrant than they had calculated, or the factor had been waiting for exactly this piece, and had acted the moment it arrived. The letter detailed a formal inquiry into Pott's collection practices. It listed the specific allegations. It suspended his collection authority effective immediately pending investigation. It requested his voluntary appearance before the assizes within 30 days, or the matter would proceed in absentia. Rogash read the copy 3 times. Then she set it on the table and looked at it. Jedediah came in from the mill, saw her face, and came to the table and read it. The silence lasted a very long time. "It is over," he said. "The inquiry is over," she said. "He will not come back." Not because the inquiry will necessarily put him in prison, it might, but these things take time, and men like Pott have lawyers, but because his authority here is suspended, and the Lake District mills are now on record as having filed documentation against him, and if he comes back and attempts any collection while suspended, he is adding contempt of an official inquiry to the existing charges. He is not stupid enough for that. Jedediah sat down slowly. She watched his face do something complicated, the release of something that had been held taut for a very long time, longer than the weeks she had been here, she thought. Years, perhaps. The long accumulating weight of watching something he had built and loved being slowly drained away by someone who had no right to it. "My father built this mill," he said. "I know I say that a lot, but he built it stone by stone, and he ran it for 23 years, and when he died he had not paid himself a real wage in 2 of those years because Pott's assessments had started climbing. He died thinking it was going to fail." She said nothing. There were no words for this that she had, and she knew that, so she did not attempt them. She moved her chair close to his and sat beside him and put her hand over his. He looked down at their hands and then up at her, and his dark eyes were wet in the way they get when a person is not crying but has gotten close to it. "He would have liked you," he said. "My father, he was the kind of man who liked people who actually did things." "I like the kind of man who builds mills," she said. He turned his hand over under hers and gripped it. They sat like that for a while. In the last week of the 30 days, they went to the Millhaven village warden, a short, cautious man named Wills Gregg, who had been the local authority on record for 15 years, and who, in the manner of people who have survived by watching which way the wind blows, had always been carefully neutral on the subject of Jedediah Alden's mill, and cautiously terrified of the large orc woman who had taken up residence in it. Gregg had the authority to record intent to marry declarations and the capacity, under the compact, to formalize bond agreements between duchy citizens and approved non-citizens. It was a brief, practical meeting in the warden's cold office above the fish market. Jedediah stated the intent formally, signing the declaration with his full name in the careful, precise hand of a man who has spent years with ledgers. Rogash stated hers. Greg's quill paused over the register for one moment too long. She could see him calibrating, deciding how to feel about this. And then, apparently, deciding that the miller who had just helped expose the tax collector was not a man whose arrangements he wanted to be on the wrong side of. He wrote her name in the register and stamped the seal. Rogash Darkwolf, he wrote. Former clan leader, Darkwolf clan. Non-citizen of Calreth Duchy. Residential protection approved per Compact Article 7. She looked at her name in the register and felt something settle. There was a formality still to be done. The compact bond, which required a witness and a formal declaration, and which was different from both a human marriage ceremony and an orc claiming ceremony, being its own kind of thing, a legal knitting, together that was neither entirely one tradition nor the other. They did it 10 days later in the mill house, with Merritt from the net repair shed as witness because Merritt was the closest thing Millhaven had to community elder, and because Jedediah had trusted her since he was 12 years old, and with old Hadra from the Darkwolf clan present as Rogash's witness, because Hadra had made the trip down from the Highland track through the winter snow specifically to be there, and that meant something. It was a cold morning in January. The fire was high. The wheel was turning. Hadra stood on Rogash's left with her arms folded, and her face neutral in the way that Rogash knew meant she was actually deeply moved. Merritt stood on Jedediah's right, dabbing her eyes almost from the beginning. They said the compact words, which were plain and direct and not particularly poetic, and Rogash thought that suited both of them well. Then Jedediah said 3 words that were not in the compact script. He said them quietly, only for her. In the moment the warden's text called for a silence, he said, "I see you," and she had to take a breath through her nose and hold herself steady, because those 3 words did something to her that the formal declarations had not. I see you. Not I choose you, not I want you, not the various things a person says at the beginning of a love. I see you. After a lifetime of being looked around, looked past, feared, deferred to, and obeyed, after the exile and the road and the dozen villages and the long cold months, he saw her. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, which was the orc-claiming gesture, the one that meant you are mine and I am yours in the oldest language she had, and she felt him go very still in the warm, aware way he went still when she did something that moved him. That was when, without entirely meaning to, or perhaps meaning to exactly and simply not warning anyone, she bit him. Gently, precisely. At the curve of his neck and shoulder where the traditional orc claim mark went, a press of tusk and tooth that left a clean crescent mark, sharp and unmistakable, an old custom, a claiming. In the Highland clans it meant chosen, it meant mine, it meant I would come back from exile for you specifically. He made a sound that was very quiet and she felt him grip her arm. Merritt made a different kind of sound. Hadra's expression finally cracked into a broad grin. Will's Greg wrote very carefully in the register and said absolutely nothing. Jedediah pulled back enough to look at her, flushed and steady, and she looked back at him with an evenness that she was aware did not entirely conceal what she was feeling, which was something deep and fierce and possessive and so tender it was almost pain. Old custom, she said. I gathered, he said. And then, without any particular performance, he said, good. Merritt definitely cried after that. Hadra helped herself to Jedediah's good whiskey, which he had brought out for the occasion, and drank 2 cups and told Rogash in the old tongue that if she ever did something foolish enough to lose this one, she was going to answer for it personally, which was the closest thing to approval Hadra had ever offered anyone. The story of the claim mark, as stories in small villages do, moved through Millhaven with remarkable speed. Not the tender version, not the whole thing, just the essential element, which was that the miller's new bondwife had bitten him at the ceremony, and that you could see the mark if his collar shifted, which it did on the second morning after, when he was unloading river wood from the dock and the cold had made him push up his sleeve and pull his collar aside, and 3 people saw the crescent bruise at his neck and told 3 more, and by evening it was general knowledge. The reactions divided cleanly along the line of who, in Millhaven, had decided to have feelings about the orc war leader living at the mill. The people who had already decided she was an asset, which included most of the fishing families, who understood that the grain trade she had opened would lower their supply costs before spring, received this information with the practical equanimity of people who are mostly concerned with whether things work. Old Merritt told anyone who would listen that it was romantic, and that she had wept for the joy of it. The 3 or 4 families who had spent the autumn muttering about the presence of an orc at the mill had a day of louder muttering, which peaked when one of them, a dockyard man named Cuff who had opinions, and not much else, decided to share those opinions directly to Jedediah's face, while Rogash was on the dock behind him. Cuff got as far as, "You let that thing mark you like a," before Rogash stepped around Jedediah and looked at Cuff. And the thing about being a former clan war leader was that you did not need to raise your voice or lift a hand to make a point. You simply looked at a person with the full weight of who you were, and most people on some animal level understood that the conversation was over. Cuff understood. He left. He did not return to the dock that day or, as it happened, for several days after. Jedediah turned around and looked at her, and she raised one eyebrow at him, and he said, very quietly so only she could hear, "You did not need to do that." "He called you a thing," she said. "I know." "No one calls you a thing," she said, and her voice was low and completely flat, and the amber of her eyes was absolutely clear. And he looked at her for a moment and then looked away with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of being completely overwhelmed in a way he found difficult to manage, which was to say, the way she looked when she was trying very hard not to show how much she felt something. "All right," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being the right word," he said. The Dunmore inquiry concluded in late February. Harwell Pott, it emerged, had been extracting false assessments across 12 settlements in the Lake District, not 6. They had only documented 6, but the Dunmore factor had been thorough once the door was opened. The Duke of Calrath, true to his reputation for not tolerating theft from his own treasury, moved swiftly. Pott's collection authority was permanently revoked. His accounts were seized. A formal recovery of excess assessments was ordered, to be distributed to the affected mills over the following 2 seasons. Pott himself fled to a cousin's estate in the Western Duchy before the warrant for personal arrest arrived, which was probably the only intelligent thing he had done in years. The letter notifying Jedediah of the assessment recovery arrived on a morning in early March, when the ice was breaking on the lake edges, and the first cautious fishing boats were going out. And he read it at the kitchen table and then put it down very carefully and did not say anything for about a minute. She was watching him from across the table. 2 seasons of overpayment, he said, returned. Yes, that is, he did the arithmetic in his head. She could see him do it. That is enough to repair the north storage barn, replace the primary wheel shaft which needs replacing, and build the extension dock we talked about. Yes, she said. And with the spring grain contracts, the Highland Run will open in 6 weeks, she said. I have written to 4 farmers, not 3. The 4th agreed in February, the one above Greywash South Pass. His yield is larger than the other 3 combined. He looked at her. The morning light was in the kitchen, pale and new and still cold, and the lake gleamed through the window, and he was looking at her with an expression that had gone beyond words, which was not unusual for him when things were very good, in the same way that it was not unusual for him when things were difficult. "You did all of this," he said. "We did all of this," she said. "You know what I mean." "I do," she said, "but I want you to know what I mean. I was exiled with nothing. I had my territory and my skills and my name, and those are not small things, but they are not enough on their own. I needed someone who trusted me with the business. Trusted me with the mill records, which was a real risk. Let me be here." She was quiet for a moment. "You let me be here." He leaned across the table and took her face in his hands the way he did, the thumbs following the line of her jaw, careful and warm, and said, "You are always going to be here. I need you to know that is not a question." She turned her face into one of his hands and pressed her cheek against his palm. The claiming mark at his neck had healed to a clean, pale scar. She wore the matching piece on her forearm where she had made it herself on the evening of the ceremony. The old custom, the reciprocal mark, the one that said, "I chose this. I gave as much as I received." He had watched her do it without flinching, had been quiet and serious about it in the way he was quiet and serious about important things, and then had kissed her wrist beside it, and she had felt that through the entire length of her spine. "I know it is not a question," she said. Spring came to Millhaven the way spring comes to Lake Country, tentatively at first, one warm day followed by 2 cold ones, and then in a rush all at once, the ice going off the lake in a single dramatic morning, the docks suddenly full of boats and noise and the particular smell of fresh water and mud, the hills above the village going green almost overnight. The mill woke up with the rest of it. There was the spring grain from the Highland route, the first mule train coming down through Rogash's Pass on a bright morning in the 3rd week of March with 4 times the load of any previous run. And she came down the last mile of track into the valley, with the spring sun on her face, and the lake glittering below, and the sound of the mill wheel turning clean in cold water. And she thought about the morning she had walked up that dock for the first time with a bruise on her face, and an axe on her back, and a plan that was mostly hope, and about how different the world looked when you were walking toward something rather than away from it. He was at the dock when she came in with the mules, because he was always at the dock when she came back from a run, always there with his hands in his coat pockets, and his dark eyes watching the path from the high track and some form of food ready inside. She led the mule train down the slope and onto the dock approach, and he took the lead rope of the first mule from her and walked beside her to the storage barn, and they unloaded together in the early spring afternoon, working in the easy rhythm of 2 people who have learned each other's pace. And when the last sack was in the barn, she sat down on a dock post and looked at the lake. "Gruth sent a letter," she said. He looked up from resecuring the barn door. "Last week," she said. "I did not mention it because I wanted to think about it first." He came and sat on the dock beside her, their shoulders together. "What did it say?" "He wants to renegotiate the approach track," she said. "He says the clan has been losing revenue since the old tithe route stopped working, which it has. 3 of the Highland clans found the new route, and they prefer it because it is faster and cheaper. He is offering to let me use the approach track freely in exchange for a formal trade agreement that gives the Darkwolf clan a percentage of the route income." "What percentage?" He said 15. "I would offer 10. He considered that. "Would you take a deal with Gruth?" "I would take a deal with the clan," she said carefully. "Not with Gruth personally. The deal I would structure would be with the Darkwolf clan council, not with him as individual leader, which means if he falls out of leadership the deal survives. And 10% of a healthy trade route is better for the clan than 100% of a failing tithe. The sub-clan elders know it. Gruth is not writing that letter because he wants to. He is writing it because the elders are pushing him to. Can you negotiate it from here?" As he paused, "As an exile," she was quiet for a moment. "The formal exile stands. I am not disputing it. But exiles can conduct business. They can hold territory. They can negotiate as private parties. The status is clear on that." She paused again. "And I do not want the leadership back. I want you to know that. I did not come here to rebuild toward reclaiming the clan. I came here because I had a plan, and this is where the plan led." And then she turned to look at him. "And then other things happened, better things." His hand found hers on the dock boards between them. "Is that enough?" He said, "A trade agreement and the pass and this." He was not asking with doubt. He was asking with the particular careful attentiveness of a man who wants to make sure that what he has to offer is actually what she needs. She looked at him. The lake was blue and wide behind him, and the docks were busy with spring boats, and the village was full of its ordinary morning noise, and the mill wheel was turning, and she thought about everything she had lost and everything she had, which was not nothing, not by a long way, and said, "It is more than enough." He kissed her there on the dock, in front of anyone who was looking, which several people were. Merritt from the net repair shed, who seemed to make a habit of witnessing things, saw it and told Hadra when Hadra came down for the spring meeting. Hadra, from the report Rogash received later, had said, with typical Hadra economy, "Good," and gone back to her tea. The negotiation with Gruth, or more accurately, with the Darkwolf clan council, took 3 weeks of letters and one face-to-face meeting at a neutral waypoint on the Highland track, which Rogash attended alone and armed, and from which she returned with a signed trade compact giving the clan 10% of the Highland route income in exchange for free passage rights on the approach track. The compact was witnessed by Hadra and 2 other council elders and was, in Rogash's legal assessment, unassailable. Gruth had not attended the meeting himself. She did not know whether that was pride or wisdom, but either way she was satisfied with the absence. She brought the signed compact back to the mill and set it on the table with the other papers, the grain contracts and the route maps and the mill ledger and the Dunmore recovery notice, and stood back and looked at the table. He came and stood beside her. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. They had dinner that evening with Merritt and 2 of the fishing families who had become friends over the winter, a loud and pleasant meal that went on long past dark, and then they were alone in the mill house with the fire and the wheel and the spring night moving on the lake outside, and she felt a kind of completeness that was quiet and deep and not dramatic, just real. He sat in his chair by the fire with a cup and she sat in her corner chair with a cup, and the fire cracked and the wheel turned and the water moved on the lake, and she looked at him in the firelight, the flower dust in his dark hair that was always there regardless of how recently he had washed, the careful set of his hands around the cup, the quiet of him, which was not emptiness but fullness. And she thought about the word exile and how it had felt for 3 months like the definition of herself. The thing that named her and would go on naming her. It did not name her now. She was Rogash Darkwolf. War leader, trade partner, bond wife, pass holder, and she was home at a miller's fire in a lake village with a mill wheel turning in the cold spring water below, and the man she loved reading something from the shelf he had just picked up with the absent comfort of someone utterly at ease. And she thought that this was the thing she had not known she was building toward through all the planning and the miles and the hard, careful work of the last months. Not security, exactly, though there was security. Not victory, though there had been victory. Something more ordinary and more rare. She was not alone. He looked up from his book and found her watching him and tilted his head slightly, the question in his face. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking." "Dangerous occupation," he said. "Frequently," she agreed. He set the book down and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention she would never stop finding remarkable and said, "What were you thinking?" "That I walked up that dock 6 months ago with a plan and very little else," she said, "and that I did not expect it to come out like this." "Like this," he said. "You mean all of this, the mill, the contracts, pot?" "Yes," she said. "And you?" His face did the thing it did when she said things plainly. The color across his cheekbones, the steadiness that was its own kind of feeling. "I did not expect you either," he said. "I had stopped, I told you. I had stopped thinking in those terms." "You should not have stopped," she said. "No," he said. "I should not have." She rose from her chair and he rose from his, and she crossed to him and put her arms around him in the simple, specific way she had learned. Was his favorite, not a warrior's grip but a person's hold. His face against her neck and her arms around his shoulders. The kind of held that meant you are safe and you are seen, and you are not going anywhere. And he held her back with the same quiet certainty. And outside the window the spring lake moved in the dark and the wheel kept turning. By the time the summer came to Millhaven, warm and long and rich with the smell of water and grain and wood smoke, the mill was running at full capacity for the first time in 6 years. The extension dock was being built. She oversaw the work because she had opinions about structural load and dock placement, and the carpenters had learned to listen to her. And the north storage barn had a new roof, and the mill wheel had its new shaft, and the Highland route was running 3 times a week with the kind of smooth reliability that came from months of careful preparation. Rogash had taken to standing at the mill house window in the mornings with her tea, looking at the lake and the docks and the boats going out in the early light. It was not a habit she had ever had before. She had been, most of her life, in motion before the sun was fully up, had found stillness difficult and rest suspicious. She had learned in the mill house that stillness could be full rather than empty, that watching the world from one place could tell you as much as moving through it. Jedediah would come up behind her on those mornings sometimes, also with his tea, and stand beside her at the window, and they would watch the lake without needing to make it into conversation. And she thought that this specific thing, this ordinary standing together in the morning light, was the part she would not have been able to describe to herself before she had it. One morning in late July she was standing at the window when she heard the mill house door and his step on the floor, and she did not turn, just waited, and he came up beside her and stood there, and after a moment said, "The Dunmore factor sent a final notice. The last recovery payment comes through next month." "Good," she said. "The mill accounts are in surplus, real surplus." For the first time. His voice was even, but she could hear what was under it. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the lake with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when something had settled into him deeply enough that it was going to live there permanently, and his eyes in the morning light were bright and dark, and she thought, as she had thought many times by now, that she was very glad she had walked up that dock. "Your father would have liked to see this," she said. "Yes," he said, "he would have." He looked at her. "Thank you. I told you," she said. We, he agreed. She put her arm around him at the window, which was an angle that required him to lean into her slightly given the difference in their heights, which he did without comment, and with the ease of a man who is entirely comfortable receiving a woman's arm around him. And they stood together in the morning light with the lake blue and wide before them, and the wheel turning below, and the summer docks already coming alive with boats and voices, and the ordinary beautiful noise of a community that is doing well. The dock was finished in August. She drove the last brace bolt herself, because she had been overseeing the build and it seemed right. And when the last board was in place, she walked to the end of it and stood over the water and looked back at the mill, at the old solid stone of it, the dark timber, the wheel turning, the window of the mill house where she could see a shape moving inside, and felt the same completeness she had felt in the spring, deeper now, worn in, the kind that does not startle you any more but simply is. He came out of the mill house and down the path to the dock, and walked its new length to where she stood and looked at the water. "Solid," he said, testing the boards with his foot. "I told the carpenters to use the heavy grade," she said. "The light grade would have flexed under loaded mule carts." "You were right," he said. "I was right most of the times I had opinions about this dock," she noted. "You were right all of the times," he said. "I just needed a moment to verify." She looked at him with the small, warm pull at the corner of her mouth that he had been specifically cataloging since early winter. He looked back at her with his dark eyes full of summer light and the same open, uncomplicated attention that had not changed since the first morning, and would not change, she understood, because it was not a performance and it was not effort. It was simply how he looked at her, which was how he had always looked at her, and which was the thing she had been most in need of in the world and had not known to name until she found it. "Come inside," he said. "I made dinner." "You always make dinner," she said. "You always eat it," he said. "It is always good," she said. He offered his hand and she took it, her scarred fingers threading through his flour-dusted ones, and they walked back up the dock together in the long summer evening light, the lake shining at their backs and the mill wheel turning in the water below. And behind them the dock was solid and new, and the storage barn was full, and the route was running, and the letters from Gruth's council were polite in the way of business correspondences that have moved past old grievances. and ahead of them the millhouse door was warm and open, and the dinner was on the fire, and the evening stretched long and unhurried before them. She ducked through the door still, always, and stood in the kitchen with the familiar smell of it, the fire and the grain dust and the particular warm wood smell of the millhouse in summer, and let the feeling settle into her bones. Home. The word that had not fit anywhere for a long time, that she had moved through the world telling herself she did not need, that she had been building toward through every careful step of the plan without fully admitting what she was building, it fit here. It fit against the weight of his hand, and the sound of the wheel and the view from the window, and she was not going to waste energy being surprised by it. She had been a war leader. She was also a pragmatist. When the ground was right, you stopped. She sat in her corner chair. He put a bowl in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Outside, the summer lake moved in the evening light, broad and free and full of the particular gold that comes when the sun gets low. The wheel turned. The boats came home to the dock. The mill house was quiet with the fullness of things being well. "Rogash," he said. She looked up. He was watching her from across the table with the lantern between them and an expression that was all the things it always was, direct and warm and a little wondering, as if even now, even after all the months of mornings and dinner tables and cold passes and dock boards and ledger sheets and hearthrug nights, he still found her remarkable. She thought he always would. She thought that was the part she had stopped fighting. "Yes," she said, before he could say whatever he had been about to say, because she knew the shape of it already, could read him the way she read weather and terrain, and because yes was the right answer regardless of the exact words. He smiled. Quiet, real, the one she would always prefer to the performed kind, the one that was just for here. "Yes," he agreed. And outside, the summer evening settled over Millhaven in gold and blue and the ordinary extraordinary grace of a day ending well, and the mill kept turning and the lake kept moving, and the two people inside the mill house knew exactly where they were, which was home.